Mr. Calloway, your vacant land is an eyesore dragging down neighborhood values. Pay $400 a month in fines or hand it over now. No negotiation.
Wednesday morning, Vivian pounded on my door, clipboard in hand, fake smile sharp, spitting those words like I was a criminal. That land is my grandfather's. He bought it in 1961. Taxes paid every year for over 60 years. Never missed one. They didn't check records. They just wanted to seize it because it looked empty and ugly. I took the notice, stared her down.
Vivienne, have you actually read your own HOA bylaws?
She laughed mockingly, climbed into her Lexus, and drove off. Huge mistake. They thought a piece of unused land had no value. They had no idea what was coming, or that it would cost them every single month for the next 30 years. What would you do if your HOA tried to take your family land? Drop your state plus worst HOA story below. Let me back you up about 14 years, because this story has roots, and roots matter. My name is Dexter Calloway, and I grew up in a mid-sized town in central Virginia, the kind of place where the hardware store still knows your truck by the sound of the engine, and the diner has served the same biscuits since 1987. My grandfather, Roscoe Calloway, bought a 2-acre parcel on the western edge of town back in 1961. Nothing fancy. A flat stretch of land beside a creek bed, rimmed by a stand of old-growth Virginia pine. He never built on it, said it was breathing room, said every family needs land that doesn't owe anybody anything. Roscoe passed in 2009, and the land passed to me. I was 41 years old, working as a facilities manager for a regional hospital system, which, if you don't know what that means, it means I spend my life keeping large, complicated buildings from falling apart through bureaucratic negligence. I know building codes. I know zoning. I know what happens when institutions try to cut corners on documentation, because I've watched them bleed money when someone finally reads the fine print. I bring that up because it's relevant, very relevant. The HOA, the Sycamore Ridge Community Association, or SRCA, had been incorporated in 2004, years after my grandfather acquired his parcel. This is important. The land predated the HOA by 43 years. When the subdivision went up around it, the developer had actually preserved the parcel's independence in the recorded plat, likely because Roscoe refused to sell and they needed his cooperation on a drainage easement. So his 2 acres sat there, surrounded on 3 sides by HOA-governed lots, technically adjacent to, but legally outside the jurisdiction of the SRCA. Technically. That word does a lot of work in this story. For the first few years after I inherited the land, nobody cared. I mowed it twice a year, kept the creek buffer clear, and paid my property taxes without a hiccup. The pines stayed. The creek ran clean. Roscoe's breathing room just breathed. Then Vivian Harcastle moved in. Vivian, and I want you to picture this clearly, was a recently retired regional sales director for a pharmaceutical company who had arrived in Sycamore Ridge with the energy of someone who had managed 17 territories and suddenly had nowhere to point it. She had the posture of a woman who had once successfully sued a contractor and had never emotionally recovered from how good it felt. Within 8 months of buying her 4-bedroom colonial on Ash Grove Court, she had run for SRCA board president, won by a margin that suggests either passionate support or catastrophically low voter turnout, and immediately began what I can only describe as a renovation of the rules. New bylaws, stricter architectural review, a community beautification initiative that resulted in 3 neighbors being fined for the wrong shade of beige on their shutters. The crunch of her Lexus on the gravel cul-de-sac became the sound residents dreaded. It meant she'd spotted something. The faint smell of the lavender hand cream she wore preceded her complaints like a warning system. She turned her attention to my land in the spring of that 3rd year of her presidency. The first letter was polite-ish. It noted that the parcel at the western boundary, described correctly as my property, appeared unmaintained and inconsistent with community standards. It requested that I attend an upcoming SRCA landscaping compliance meeting. I did not attend. The second letter was less polite. It claimed the land had been effectively abandoned, and that the SRCA was exploring whether it qualified for adverse possession proceedings under Virginia law. Adverse possession. For land my grandfather bought 60 years ago, and I've been paying taxes on every single year. I put that letter on my kitchen counter, poured myself a cup of coffee. the thick, burnt-edge kind you make when you're annoyed enough to forget to set a timer, and started reading. I want to be clear about something before I tell you what happened next. I am not, by nature, a confrontational person. I'm the guy who smiles at the grocery store even when someone cuts in line. I believe in documentation over drama. I believe in reading the actual statute before you open your mouth in a meeting. Vivian Hardcastle was about to discover that these qualities are not weaknesses. I called a real estate attorney, a woman named Priscilla Odom, who had been practicing property law in Central Virginia for 26 years, and had the kind of quiet confidence that comes from having seen every variety of neighbor dispute humanity is capable of generating. I explained the situation. She asked me 2 questions. Did I have the original deed, and had I been paying taxes continuously? Yes and yes. She laughed, not meanly, just the laugh of someone who has seen this exact movie before. They can't touch it, she said. Adverse possession requires the claimant's use to be hostile, open, continuous, and exclusive. You paying taxes blows that up before they even file. Legal takeaway. Continuous payment of property taxes is one of the strongest defenses against adverse possession claims. It proves you never abandoned ownership. I sent Priscilla's response letter, polite, precise, citing Virginia Code Section 55.1-2308, to the SRCA board on a Thursday. By Friday afternoon, I had a voicemail from Vivienne herself. Her tone had shifted from official to personal, which is always a tell. She said, and I'm reconstructing from memory here, that she was simply trying to protect the investment values of the entire community, and that she hoped I would come to the table in good faith. I wrote back, in email, with read receipts enabled. I was happy to discuss reasonable community concerns, but I would need any proposed actions regarding my property submitted in writing with specific bylaw references and their legal basis. She did not like that. The next SRCA board meeting, a Tuesday evening affair held in the clubhouse that smelled perpetually of old carpet and someone's ambitious attempt at an air freshener, produced a new resolution. The board voted, 4-1, to designate my parcel as a community eyesore under a vaguely worded aesthetic standards clause, and to begin fining me $400 per month until I either improved the appearance or entered into a formal land use agreement with the HOA. Land use agreement, which, buried in the draft they sent me, included a provision granting the SRCA a perpetual right of first refusal on any commercial use or lease of the parcel. Read that sentence again. They wanted me to sign away my right to lease my own land without their permission. Forever. Dressed up as a neighborly cleanup agreement. I did not sign. Instead, I did something they didn't expect. I went to the town hall and pulled the original recorded plat from 1961, the one where the developer had documented the exact legal boundaries of my grandfather's parcel and its relationship to what would become the Sycamore Ridge subdivision. I sat in that county records office, fluorescent lights humming above me, the faint smell of old paper and municipal disregard, and I read every page. And on page 7 of the plat documentation, I found a note in the margin, handwritten, initialed by the original surveyor. It referenced a utility corridor that ran along the western edge of my parcel, a corridor that had been designated for future telecommunications or infrastructure development by the county's 1998 Comprehensive Plan update. I photographed every page. Meanwhile, Vivian escalated. The next month's fine letter arrived, and with it, a notice that the SRCA intended to bring suit in General District Court to enforce the aesthetic standards fine schedule. $400 a month. They were serious, or performing seriousness, which in HOA politics is indistinguishable. My neighbor across the way, a retired postal worker named Gus Fenwick, who had lived in Sycamore Ridge since the development opened, and had the particular world weariness of a man who had watched Vivienne fire 3 landscaping contractors in 2 years, knocked on my truck window one afternoon when I was parked near the parcel. He leaned in through the window, smelling faintly of motor oil and the cigarettes he'd theoretically quit. "She's telling people your land is dragging down their home values," he said. "I heard her at the Hendersons' party." "What are people saying back?" I asked. Gus shrugged. "Some believe her, some don't. Most just don't want trouble." I nodded. "That's fine," I said. "I don't need them right now. I just need the county zoning office and a cell signal map. Gus squinted at me. You got something going on? Not yet, I said, but I will. The acorn of a plan, small, hard, patient, had started to take shape. I want to tell you about cell towers, because most people don't think about them until their phone drops a call in the worst possible moment, and then they think about nothing else. The United States has a serious rural and peri-urban coverage gap problem. Carriers, your Verizons, your AT&Ts, your T-Mobiles, are under constant regulatory and competitive pressure to expand network coverage. They need tower sites, ground-level sites on elevated or strategically positioned parcels, close to residential density, ideally with existing utility access nearby. They need these sites badly enough that they pay for them, sometimes very well. A telecom infrastructure company called Meridian Tower Partners had been quietly sending letters to landowners in a 6-county radius, looking for lease candidates for new small cell and macro tower installations. I know this because 3 weeks after finding that utility corridor notation in the plat records, I made a few calls. I spoke to a land acquisition specialist at Meridian named Trent Burgess, a cheerful, fast-talking man who sounded like he'd been caffeinating since 5 a.m. And I described my parcel, its dimensions, its location, its proximity to the county road, its existing utility access via the 1998 corridor designation. There was a pause on the line. The kind of pause that means someone is calculating. Is there any HOA jurisdiction on that parcel? Trent asked. No, I said. The land predates the HOA by 43 years. It's legally independent. Another pause. Can you send me the plat documentation? I sent it that afternoon. Meanwhile, Vivian had not been idle. She had done something clever, I'll give her that. She had contacted the county's code enforcement division and filed a complaint arguing that unmowed vegetation on my parcel exceeded the county's weed ordinance height limit. The county sent an inspector. The inspector measured the grass. It was, according to the report, 11 inches tall in one section. The county ordinance cap was 10 inches. 1 inch. She got me on 1 inch of grass. I received a county notice alongside the ongoing HOA fines. Mow the grass or face a separate municipal fine schedule. I mowed the grass. I mowed it to 4 inches, perfectly, on a Tuesday, in a rented zero-turn mower that left clean, parallel lines visible from the road. I want you to picture the sound of that, the thick whir of the mower deck, the spray of cut grass, the smell of green and slightly damp earth on a cool October morning. Then I photographed the result and emailed the documentation to both the county and the SRCA, noting the date, time, and compliance with the relevant ordinance. Vivian's response was to call an emergency board meeting and pass a new resolution. My parcel would be subject to monthly inspection, and any deficiency, including but not limited to overgrown vegetation, standing water, unauthorized access paths, or visual inconsistency with community character, would result in compounded fines. Visual inconsistency with community character. I've been chewing on that phrase for years. It has no legal definition. It is purely vibes-based governance. But it's also the kind of language that's very hard to challenge cheaply, because disputing vague aesthetic standards in court costs more than just paying the fine. And Vivienne knew it. She also knew, I suspect, that I hadn't signed the land use agreement. And she started asking questions about why I was so resistant to signing. Through Gus, who had become something of an informal intelligence network at this point, I learned she had told at least 2 board members that she believed I was planning to do something commercial with the land, and that she intended to get ahead of it. She was right. She was just too late. Because 2 weeks after my conversation with Trent Burgess at Meridian Tower Partners, I received a formal letter of intent. They wanted to lease my parcel, specifically the western section adjacent to the utility corridor, for the installation of a telecommunications tower. The preliminary lease terms were 45 years with a 5-year renewal option, and an annual lease payment in the range of $28,000 per year, with a 3% annual escalator. $28,000 a year. For land my grandfather bought for $1,100. I sat in my truck in the parking lot of a Sheetz gas station when I read that email. Engine idling, the the smell of diesel and fried food drifting through the cracked window, and I felt something I hadn't felt since this whole ordeal started. Not anger, not vindication, just the calm, steady click of pieces fitting together. I called Priscilla Odom. "How fast can you review a commercial land lease?" I asked. "How complicated is it?" she said. 45 years, telecom tower, HOA adjacent parcel. A beat. Then, "Send it tonight." While Priscilla was reviewing the Meridian lease, Vivian made her boldest move yet. And I want to give her credit, in the specific way you give credit to a chess opponent who plays an aggressive gambit. It was well constructed. It just didn't account for the position I was already in. She went to the County Board of Supervisors. Specifically, she requested a meeting with the district supervisor to argue that my parcel should be designated as a blight district under Virginia's Rehabilitation, Redevelopment, and Community Development Act. If approved, a blight designation would allow the county to compel remediation, meaning I'd be legally required to develop or improve the land on a county-enforced timeline, or face escalating municipal penalties independent of the HOA fines. It was a smart play. Blight designations exist for genuinely abandoned, dangerous properties. Vivian knew that getting that label attached to my land would either force my hand, make me sell, develop, or sign the SRCA's land use agreement, or bury me in legal costs, fighting it off. She brought photographs to the supervisors' meeting. She brought a petition signed by 41 Sycamore Ridge residents. She brought a prepared statement about community investment, home values, and the vision the original developers had for this neighborhood. What she did not bring was an attorney who had actually read the blight designation statute. Because Virginia Code Section 3649 defines a blighted area as one characterized by unsafe or unsanitary conditions, defective or inadequate utilities, deteriorated improvements, faulty street layouts, or conditions that endanger life or property. It's a high bar, deliberately. The statute exists to address genuinely hazardous urban decay, not 2 acres of clean Virginia pine and well-mowed grass. I know this because Priscilla had flagged it in her first research memo to me, weeks before Vivian ever filed the request. My attorney had, in essence, already built the counter-argument before the attack was even launched. I attended the supervisors' meeting. I had not announced I would be there. I sat in the back row of that county meeting room, metal folding chairs, the tick of an institutional clock, the faint chemical smell of dry erase markers, and I let Vivian present her case, all 22 minutes of it. I watched the supervisor, a practical-looking man named Walt Duffin, who had the expression of someone who had been doing this job long enough to recognize an HOA dispute dressed up as a public safety concern. When Vivian finished, Supervisor Duffin asked if there were any other parties who wished to speak. I walked to the podium. I presented 3 things: a current survey of the parcel showing no unsafe structures, no standing water, no hazardous conditions of any kind, a copy of my continuous property tax payment record going back to 2009, and Priscilla's 2-page legal memo explaining precisely why the parcel did not meet the statutory definition of blight. Then I said one more thing. I told Supervisor Duffin that I was in active negotiations to lease the parcel for a commercial telecommunications installation, which would generate property tax revenue for the county, improve cellular coverage for a residential area that had been in a partial dead zone for years, and represent a legitimate, permitted commercial use of private land. The room was very quiet. Vivian turned around from the front row and looked at me. It was the first time we had been in the same physical space. She was well-dressed, controlled, with the steady gaze of someone who does not like being surprised. But behind that gaze, just briefly, I saw it. She hadn't known. She'd had no idea how far along the Meridian deal already was. Supervisor Duffin declined to advance the blight designation request. He suggested that if the SRCA had concerns about the planned commercial installation, they could pursue those concerns through the appropriate land use channels. Walking out of the county building into the gray November afternoon, wind carrying the smell of cold asphalt and dead leaves, I passed Vivian on the steps. She didn't speak, neither did I, but that night she called an emergency SRCA board meeting, and according to Gus, who had a neighbor on the board who reported back, she spent 40 minutes arguing that the board needed to find a way to block the tower lease. She kept saying, "There has to be a mechanism," Gus told me over the phone, but nobody could find one. There wasn't one, because the land was mine, because it predated the HOA, because my grandfather had had the foresight to never sell what he didn't need to sell. Roscoe Calloway's breathing room was about to start breathing money. Here's where the story changes shape. 3 days after the county meeting, Priscilla called me, not with a routine update, but with the tone she used when something genuinely interesting had surfaced. She'd been doing a title search as standard due diligence for the Meridian lease, and she'd found something in the SRCA's own recorded governing documents that neither of us had looked for because we hadn't known to look. When the Sycamore Ridge subdivision was developed in 2004, the developer had recorded a master declaration of covenants, conditions, and restrictions, the CC&Rs, that formed the legal basis of the HOA, standard stuff. But in Section 14, subsection C, buried in the language about community infrastructure and utility easements, there was a clause that read, in summary, any telecommunications infrastructure installed within or adjacent to the community boundaries, including on parcels with existing easement relationships, would require the SRCA to maintain and fund a proportional share of utility corridor access costs, defined as any municipal or county-assessed fees related to infrastructure corridor maintenance. The utility corridor that ran along the western edge of my grandfather's parcel, the same corridor that Meridian needed for their installation's underground conduit routing, was classified in the county's records as a shared access utility corridor, meaning it was partially encumbered by both my property and the adjacent Sycamore Ridge lots. What this meant, in practice, once the tower was installed and the corridor was activated for its designated telecommunications use, the county's infrastructure cost-sharing formula would kick in. And under that formula, which was tied to the CC&R's Section 14 language, the SRCA would be assessed a recurring corridor access maintenance fee. The fee was not enormous, but it was real, and it was automatic, and it would be collected annually, adjusting with the county's infrastructure rate schedule. Vivian's HOA, the organization that had been fining me, threatening me, attempting to designate my land as blighted, and trying to force me to sign away my lease rights, would be legally required to contribute to the maintenance of the very infrastructure corridor that made my tower lease possible. They would be, in the most satisfying technical sense, partially funding their own defeat. Priscilla explained this to me twice, because the first time I genuinely thought I'd misunderstood. I hadn't. She'd had a county infrastructure attorney review it. It was solid. How did this clause end up in their CC&Rs? I asked. The 2004 developer was probably using a boilerplate declaration template and didn't read it carefully, she said. They grabbed the standard utility infrastructure language from a larger planned community template without realizing the county's corridor access rules would apply. Legal and financial takeaway. HOA governing documents, CC&Rs, bylaws, and plat notes are public records. A title attorney can find provisions that even the HOA board doesn't know exist, and those provisions are legally binding, regardless of whether the board understands them. I sat with this information for about 24 hours. I didn't tell anyone. Not Gus, not my sister who'd been following the story with gleeful updates, not my buddy Harlan who worked in commercial real estate and had been offering advice since the beginning. I just let it settle. Then I called Trent Burgess at Meridian and told him I was ready to proceed. We set a closing date for the lease. We coordinated with the county on corridor activation paperwork, and I started thinking about the annual HOA meeting coming up in February, the one where financial disclosures were required, the one where every Sycamore Ridge homeowner would see, in the budget line items, exactly what this had cost them. I started looking forward to February. Let me walk you through what the next 6 weeks looked like, because this is the part of the story where preparation becomes its own kind of satisfaction. Priscilla and I finalized the Meridian lease. 45 years, annual payment of $28,200, escalating 3% per year. By year 10, I'd be pulling over $36,000 annually. By year 20, nearly $49,000, for land that asks nothing of me except existence. Priscilla negotiated a buyout protection clause, meaning if Meridian or any successor company wanted to terminate the lease early, they owed a penalty payment equivalent to 5 years of remaining lease value. We also structured the lease so that tower maintenance, structural liability, and all utility access costs on Meridian's side were exclusively Meridian's responsibility. I wasn't on the hook for anything except owning the dirt underneath. That's the first financial trick worth filing away. Ground lease structures for cell towers typically place all construction, maintenance, and liability costs on the carrier or tower company, leaving the landowner with pure passive income. If you own land near a coverage gap, even an acre, it's worth calling a telecom land acquisition broker. Simultaneously, I worked with a county surveyor, a methodical man named Barton Reeves, who wore the same steel-toed work boots every day, regardless of weather, and communicated largely through grunts and survey flags, to formally document the boundary markers between my parcel and the adjacent SRCA-governed lots. This wasn't legally required for the Meridian deal, but I wanted it done. Clean, recorded, unambiguous. No one was going to claim encroachment or confusion after the tower went up. Barton sank new pins at all four corners of the parcel on a cold January morning, frozen ground crunching under his boots, the smell of wood smoke drifting from a house 2 lots over. The pins were bright orange, very visible, the kind of visible that communicates, to any reasonable adult, that this land has an owner who is paying attention. Third, I addressed the HOA fines directly. They had been accumulating, $400 a month since the resolution, now totaling several months of claimed penalties. I had not paid them. Instead, I had Priscilla draft a formal dispute letter challenging each fine, on the basis that the aesthetic standards clause used to justify them lacked a legally sufficient definition and had been applied selectively and without proper notice under Virginia's Property Owners Association Act, which requires 30-day written notice and a formal hearing opportunity before fines can be enforced. The Virginia POA Act is a powerful tool that most HOA residents don't know about. Under Virginia Code Section 55.1-1828, an HOA cannot enforce fines without providing written notice of the violation and a reasonable opportunity to cure. And if they skip those steps, the fine is unenforceable. Vivian had been issuing fine notices without holding the required hearings. Every fine she'd sent me was legally defective. I didn't announce this yet, I just held it. Meanwhile, Gus had become my informal community liaison, less a spy than a guy who talked to everyone and reported back because he found the whole situation entertaining, in the way only retired people with good memories and no remaining patience for nonsense can. He told me that sentiment on the street was shifting. People were starting to ask questions. Why was the board spending HOA resources pursuing one landowner? Why had dues increased for the 3rd year in a row? Why was the reserve fund looking thin? I'd also quietly reached out to 3 Sycamore Ridge residents I knew were dissatisfied with the current board. Gus, a woman named Bethany Doyle who had been on the original 2004 founding board and had been squeezed out by Vivian's faction, and a younger homeowner named Prescott Kimball who worked in municipal finance and had been asking uncomfortable questions about the SRCA's budget at public meetings. I wasn't organizing a coup. I was just making sure that when the February annual meeting arrived, there would be informed people in the room who knew how to ask the right questions. The tower construction permit came through in the 3rd week of January. Meridian's crew would break ground in early spring. The county infrastructure corridor activation paperwork was filed. The Section 14 cost-sharing mechanism would engage automatically upon first use of the corridor, which would occur the moment Meridian ran their underground conduit. Everything was in place. All the pieces were where they needed to be. All that remained was the meeting. Vivian did not go quietly into that winter. I want to make sure that's clear, because in the weeks before the February meeting, she launched what I can only describe as a final form offensive, and it had 3 distinct phases. Phase 1 was a smear campaign, conducted through the SRCA's official community newsletter, a 4-page document that arrived in mailboxes on the 1st of every month, and usually contained things like HOA meeting minutes and reminders about parking rules. The January edition included a full-page community safety update that described, without naming me directly, a commercial development proposal on a non-HOA parcel adjacent to our community that would bring increased traffic, electromagnetic radiation concerns, and potential disruption to the neighborhood's established visual character. Electromagnetic radiation, she went there. The letter cited no studies. It referenced no specific regulations. It was pure, ambient fear generation, the kind of communication designed to make readers anxious without giving them anything concrete enough to fact-check. And it worked, at least initially. Gus reported that several residents were calling the board office with questions, and that 2 people had mentioned health concerns at a neighborhood coffee gathering. I drafted a response letter of my own. I submitted it to the newsletter as a letter to the editor, which the SRCA's own bylaws required them to publish if submitted 30 days before the next edition. My letter cited the FCC's radio frequency emission standards for telecommunications towers, noted that the proposed installation would comply with all federal, state, and county regulations, and included a link to the American Cancer Society's public position on cell tower RF exposure. 2 paragraphs, factual, calm. I also noted, with no particular drama, that the parcel in question was private property predating the HOA, and that the commercial lease had been executed in full compliance with all applicable laws. The newsletter ran it. Vivian couldn't stop it without violating her own rules. Phase 2 was an attempt at bribery, and I use that word carefully because legally it wasn't bribery, but functionally it was the same thing with better vocabulary. She had the board authorize an offer. If I agreed to terminate the Meridian lease negotiations and enter into the SRCA land use agreement, the HOA would forgive all accumulated fines, fund a community enhancement project on my parcel, and guarantee a preferred neighbor status that would exempt my property from future aesthetic standard reviews for a period of 10 years. The offer arrived via certified letter. It had the formal weight of something a lawyer had looked at, probably the same association attorney who had drafted the original fine notices. I read it standing in my kitchen, eating a sandwich over the sink the way bachelor facilities managers do. I set it down next to my coffee mug. Then I called Priscilla. "Can I decline in writing in a way that creates a record for later?" I asked. "Absolutely," she said. "I'll draft it." The decline letter noted, politely, that the Meridian lease had already been executed and recorded with the county, making the offer moot. It also preserved our position on the fines. We sent it the same week. Phase 3 was the most aggressive and the most legally reckless. Vivian had apparently convinced the SRCA board to retain an attorney to explore whether the tower installation could be challenged through an injunction, arguing that it constituted a nuisance to adjacent HOA-governed properties. The attorney, reportedly a general practice lawyer from a small firm who specialized primarily in family law and had taken the HOA work because it was local, sent a demand letter to Meridian Tower Partners, threatening injunctive action. Meridian's legal team, who handled telecom infrastructure disputes professionally and with significant resources, responded in approximately 5 business days. Their response letter was 42 pages long. It cited the Telecommunications Act of 1996, Section 704, which explicitly prohibits local governments, and by extension private entities, from effectively prohibiting the provision of wireless communication services based on the environmental effects of RF emissions or aesthetic concerns. It also noted that injunctive challenges to properly permitted telecom installations face an extremely high legal bar, and that any litigation would be aggressively defended. The Telecommunications Act of 1996, Section 704, is one of the most powerful legal shields for cell tower installations. It limits the ability of local bodies to block legitimate wireless infrastructure on aesthetic or community character grounds. Meridian knew this cold. Vivian's attorney probably did not. The injunction threat evaporated. February was 1 week away. The annual meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday evening at 7 o'clock, in the same clubhouse with the same sad carpet. The community budget report would be presented. Board elections would be held. Financial disclosures were required by the SRCA's own bylaws. Gus called me the Sunday before. "You going?" he asked. "Wouldn't miss it," I said. The week before the February meeting, I did something that might seem counterintuitive. I went completely quiet. No letters, no emails, no responses to the increasingly terse communications from the SRCA's attorney. I paid my county property taxes, on time, electronically, with automatic confirmation. And I confirmed with Priscilla that all our documentation was organized, indexed, and ready to be produced. Then I went about my regular week. I had a hospital HVAC system to oversee, and 3 facilities contractors to coordinate, and the mundane, solid work of keeping a large building functional was, honestly, a relief. Meanwhile, Meridian's crews were doing preliminary site work, surveying, soil testing, a utility locate request. They weren't breaking ground yet, but the equipment had been on my parcel twice that week. Orange flags, white painted ground lines, the beginning of something permanent. Gus reported that the neighborhood was aware of the activity. People were stopping at the edge of the road to look. Some were curious, some were annoyed. A few, Gus said, had started asking questions about the fines, specifically why the HOA had spent what appeared to be significant amounts on legal correspondence over the past several months, and whether that was reflected anywhere in the budget. It was reflected in the budget. That was the thing Vivian had not thought through carefully enough. The SRCA's bylaws required a full financial disclosure at the annual meeting, including legal expenses. The legal fees generated by her campaign against me, attorney letters, the failed blight designation preparation, the injunction threat to Meridian, had been paid from the HOA's operating account, the account funded by homeowner dues. Bethany Doyle, the former board member I'd spoken to, had done the math. Based on the previous year's attorney billing rates and the known volume of correspondence, she estimated the board had spent between $11,000 and $14,000 in legal fees, pursuing an action against land they had no jurisdiction over. $11,000 to $14,000 of neighbor money. Prescott Kimball had also been busy. Working from publicly available county records, he had pulled the HOA's reserve fund disclosures and noted that the fund was underfunded relative to the community's infrastructure needs, a fact that, combined with the legal expense question, was going to make for a very uncomfortable budget presentation. Neither Bethany nor Prescott had coordinated with me directly on what they were planning to say at the meeting. They didn't need to. They just needed to be there and ask questions that the documents already answered. I prepared my own materials, one folder, clean, tabbed, containing the original 1961 deed, the continuous tax payment records, the recorded Meridian lease, the county plat documentation with the utility corridor notation, the Section 14CC and R language, and the county infrastructure attorney's opinion on the cost-sharing mechanism, and the full legal dispute record for every fine the SRCA had attempted to collect, with Priscilla's analysis of each one's procedural defects. I ironed a shirt. That's how you know something is significant. When a facilities manager irons a shirt on a weeknight. There's something worth noting about the quietness of that preparation week, because I think it's the most psychologically interesting part of the story. Vivian had spent months being loud. Fines, letters, petitions, board resolutions, legal threats, newsletter editorials. She had been constantly in motion, constantly generating pressure, constantly trying to force a response. And what I had learned, partly from Priscilla, partly from 14 years of managing institutions where people confuse activity with effectiveness, is that the best counter to a pressure campaign is to let the pressure campaign exhaust itself against facts. You don't fight loud with loud. You just make sure that when the loud stops, the truth is sitting there, fully documented, waiting calmly to be read. The night before the meeting, I called my sister. She lives in Charlottesville and had been following everything with the invested enthusiasm of a person who had no personal exposure to the consequences. "Are you nervous?" she asked. "No," I said. "Everything that needed to happen has already happened. Tomorrow is just showing people the receipts." She laughed. "Roscoe would have loved this," she said. I thought about my grandfather for a moment. A man who bought land because he believed in owning something that didn't owe anybody anything. A man who never imagined his 2 acres of Virginia pine and creek bed would become the site of a telecom infrastructure dispute, a $28,000 annual passive income stream, and one of the most satisfying Tuesday evenings of his grandson's life. "Yeah," I said, "he really would have." The Sycamore Ridge Community Association annual meeting opened at 7:04 p.m. on a Tuesday in February, in the clubhouse on Ash Grove Court. The carpet still smelled like it always did. There were 63 residents present, more than double the usual attendance because word had traveled. People brought their own copies of the newsletter. A few had printed things from the county website. 2 people had brought lawyers, though only one of those lawyers was there at my request. Priscilla sat in the third row, a legal pad on her knee, looking like someone who had been waiting a long time for a meeting exactly like this one. Vivian called the meeting to order. She was composed, well-dressed, in the pale blue blazer she wore at every formal HOA event. She moved through the procedural opening with efficient authority. Then she handed the floor to the board treasurer for the financial report. The treasurer, a mild accountant type named Duncan Fitch, who looked like he genuinely wished he were somewhere else, presented the budget, line by line. Maintenance costs, landscaping, insurance, administrative expenses. Then, legal expenses. $62,400 for the fiscal year, nearly triple the prior year's figure of $22,000. The room changed temperature, not loudly, just a shift. The sound of people sitting forward in their chairs, the creak of folding metal. Prescott Kimball raised his hand. Duncan acknowledged him with the expression of a man who had been expecting this. "Can the board itemize what generated the increase in legal expenses?" Prescott asked. His voice was clear and professional. He had done this before. Duncan looked at Vivian. Vivian said that the board had retained outside counsel for a range of community protection matters, and that detailed itemization was available to any homeowner upon written request. "I've made that request," Prescott said. "In writing, 30 days ago. I haven't received a response." He held up a copy of his request letter, and in that moment, the room understood that this was not an improvised question. Bethany Doyle raised her hand next. She asked about the reserve fund. She had numbers. She read them. The room listened. Then a homeowner near the back, someone I didn't know, a man with the broad shoulders and direct manner of someone who works with his hands, asked a simple question. Did all of this legal spending have anything to do with the Callaway parcel? Vivian said that the board had been protecting community interests from an aggressive commercial development. On land that isn't in the HOA, the man said. It wasn't a question. I stood up. Not dramatically. I didn't sweep papers off a table or thunder to the microphone. I just stood up from my seat in the fourth row and raised my hand. Vivian looked at me. I looked at her. "I'd like to address the membership," I said. "Under the SRCA's bylaws, any property owner, including owners of non-HOA parcels with adjacent easement relationships, had the right to address the full membership at an annual meeting. Vivian could not refuse me without violating her own rules. She nodded briefly, with the expression of a person who has watched a chess clock run out. I walked to the front. I put my folder on the podium. I spoke for 11 minutes. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't editorialize much. I just presented the timeline, the original deed, the continuous tax payments, the adverse possession threat that had no legal basis, the blight designation that didn't meet the statutory definition, the fines that had never followed proper POA Act notice procedures. I presented the Meridian lease, recorded, legal, passive income, and I presented the Section 14 clause. I explained the Section 14 clause slowly because I wanted everyone in the room to understand it. The SRCA's own governing documents, drafted by their own founding developer and in force since 2004, required the HOA to contribute to corridor access maintenance costs once the telecommunications infrastructure corridor adjacent to my parcel was activated. The corridor had been activated. The county had already sent the SRCA its first assessment notice, $1,140 for the current fiscal year. I held up the county notice. I read the line item aloud. The room was completely silent. Then Gus Fenwick, from the back, said, "So we've been paying to fight a man over land we can't touch, and now we're also paying for his tower?" Someone laughed. Then several people laughed. Not mean laughter, more the laughter of recognition, the specific sound of people understanding that they had been managed by someone operating on their behalf without their genuine consent. Vivian stood. She said something about proper process, about the board acting in good faith, about how these decisions had been made to protect community values. A woman in the second row said, quietly but audibly, "Whose values?" Priscilla stood. She noted, for the record, that the HOA's fine schedule for my property had not followed required notice procedures under Virginia Code Section 55.1-1828, rendering every assessed fine legally unenforceable. She offered to provide the full citation record to any homeowner or their attorney. Board elections were held. Vivian ran for re-election. She received 9 votes. Bethany Doyle was elected board president. Prescott Kimball took treasurer. Gus was elected to the general seat, which he accepted with visible reluctance and quiet satisfaction. Walking out into the cold February night, the air sharp and clean, the faint creak of pine branches in the wind, I stood in the gravel parking lot for a moment and just breathed. The lights from the clubhouse spilled yellow across the cars. Somewhere, under 2 acres of Virginia soil, a conduit was already waiting to carry signal. My grandfather's land. Still breathing. It's been 2 years since that February meeting. Here's where things stand. The Meridian Tower was completed in late spring, following the annual meeting. A 65-foot monopole, clean and narrow, installed on the western section of the parcel adjacent to the utility corridor. It blends into the tree line about as well as a monopole can, which is to say it's visible, but it's also functional, and the neighborhood that was in a partial dead zone for 15 years can now make phone calls from their backyards. 3 neighbors have thanked me for that. One of them was a woman whose elderly mother had not been able to call for help during a minor emergency because she couldn't get a signal inside the house. That one landed differently than the others. The first annual lease payment from Meridian cleared in July, $28,200. I looked at that number for a while. Then I called my accountant and started planning. 20% of the annual lease income now funds a scholarship, the Roscoe Callaway Land and Community Scholarship, awarded annually to a graduating senior from the local high school who demonstrates commitment to either land stewardship, environmental science, or civic advocacy. The first recipient was a 17-year-old girl who had spent 3 summers doing creek restoration work along the county's waterways, including the creek that runs along the edge of my grandfather's parcel. I attended the award presentation. I did not make a speech. I just handed her the check and shook her hand and thought about a man who believed in land that didn't owe anybody anything. Another 10% of the annual payment funds a conservation easement maintenance contribution. I've placed a voluntary easement on the eastern half of the parcel, preserving the stand of old-growth Virginia pine in perpetuity. The easement is held by the Blue Ridge Land Conservancy. It means that section of the parcel cannot be developed, ever, regardless of who owns it. Roscoe's trees will be there after both of us are gone. The new SRCA board, under Bethany Doyle's leadership, issued a formal written retraction of all previously assessed fines against my property, acknowledged the procedural errors in the prior board's fine schedule, and updated their bylaws to include clearer notice and hearing requirements before any future fines could be enforced. Bethany told me privately that the prior board's legal bills had consumed most of the operating reserve that had been intended for clubhouse repairs, and that she was spending her first year essentially rebuilding the community's financial footing. Vivian Harcastle put her house on the market 6 months after the annual meeting. I don't know where she moved. I genuinely wish her well, in the way you wish someone well when you hope they have found a community where they can channel their considerable energy towards something that actually helps people. The county HOA corridor assessment, the Section 14 item, continues to appear in the SRCA's annual budget. It is $1,140 per year, escalating slightly with county infrastructure rates. It's not a large number, but it is a permanent line item, and it means that every year, when the new SRCA board presents the budget to the membership, there is a reminder of what happens when an HOA mistakes jurisdiction for ownership and mistakes loudness for strategy. I still drive past the parcel most weeks. The pines are there, the creek runs, the tower stands straight against the sky. Sometimes I stop and get out of the truck and just stand at the edge of the property for a minute, the cold air carrying the smell of pine resin and creek water and distance. It doesn't feel like victory, exactly. It feels more like what my grandfather probably felt when he bought the land in the first place. The quiet, uncomplicated satisfaction of owning something that doesn't owe anybody anything.
You know what stayed with me about Dexter's story? Not the tower, not even the money. In that moment at the door, Wednesday morning, Vivian standing there, clipboard in hand, already done with the conversation before it started. And Dexter just asked her one question. Have you actually read your own bylaws? She laughed, dropped off. What about in that situation? We react, we get angry, say something we regret, or go quiet and stew on it for weeks. Either way, they already want that moment. Because That's exactly what the finest, the letters, the $400 dress are designed to do. Make you feel like you're already losing. I don't know how many of you have been through something like this. Maybe not a cell tower situation. Maybe just a vest, a thin color, a letter that made your blood pressure spike before you even finish reading it. If you have, drop it in the comments. I read that. Doesn't have to be dramatic. Sometimes the quiet ones are the most interesting. If this is the kind of story you come here for, hit subscribe. We got more coming. Different people, different stage, same pattern showing up again and again. Next situation would be the last one like it, not even close.